Among the Trapped. Between Good and Evil. Written by Jared Neely. Chapter 5, The Ones WHO Watch. Avil peered to the window ahead, where the musky night had somehow turned to dawn. Sunlight beamed inwards at her standing along the doorway. The sun had rose surprisingly outside and begun to glisten into the room surrounding her. Stumped, she hadn't realized how quickly time had moved since arriving back at the farm. It appeared only minutes had rounded from the clock. She felt as if she had already rested. Her body was rejuvenated and exuberant. A feeling she hadn't remembered having since a child. This is very strange, she thought. The sunlight beaming through the storm glass seemed to radiate heat until it reached her in the doorway. The strapping light appeared to lose all of its vitality just where she stood watching. It can't be, I can't feel anything, no warmth, no heat? She pondered as she stretched her fingers out to sense the sun directed at her from in the window, immediately panicking at the indifference. Shiz. Avil suddenly jumped back, unnerved by the instant sound wailing from across the room. Dennis's Watson FM radio receiver had startled her. Her eyes glared frantically across the room, briskly observing the alarm sitting above the mahogany dresser. Noisy radio waves continued to shoot out from the tiny speaker, sending static electricity hissing into the decorated room. Avil glared at the 80s radio, listening to it, where relics covered the entire dresser. "Avil?" cried an unfamiliar voice, someone channeling her from the other side. She watched in horror, listening to the hissing and the voice behind it. "Avil? I can't see you, dear, are you able to hear me?" The voice spoke clearer this time. The hissing began to steady itself as she gripped the door at her side. "Come inside, Avil, it's your father, baby!" shrieked a voice, unlike anything she'd ever heard. The intertwining sounds of static and off-pitch bellows frightened her as she stared in overpowering fear. She remained silently waiting for the mixture of unrecognizable voices to return. A moment passed. Attentively standing by the door, she gazed at the FM Watson radio sitting oddly placed in the center of the unusual dresser until it hissed again and crackled, and then a voice broke through. A fierce growling sound came rumbling through, almost vibrating the radio from the top of the chest. "We need you, Avil," hissed wickedly a sickening demonic voice, sending instant chills down her entire body as she horrifyingly listened from beyond the archway. "Come inside the radio and visit us, dead is better." A nasty, hateful mixture of evil voices jumbled into one clamored towards her from afar. Her heart began to beat heavily, causing her chest to tighten. She quietly spun around facing the hall and stepped out, abandoning the frightening sounds communicating with her. Immediately running for the stairs and the den below, she found herself alone again downstairs. "Dennis? Lonnie? Are you home?" she shrieked, noticing Alex or his wheelchair was nowhere to be seen. Trembling as she faced the stairs glaring up into the rafters where their bedroom sat lonesome in the sunlight, she briskly turned again, immediately feeling not alone anymore. Something was privately watching her. Avil could feel its presence as she circled the den. Approaching the front doorway, she stopped and peered out from the peephole of the heavy outside door. The couple's 1972 Volkswagen Combi camper vans still sat parked in the driveway, but something was strange as she examined them in the undying light. Under the astonishing sunlight, they appeared no longer sheen or lustrous as she eyed them from inside. The clear coating along the paint was now beginning to fade in discoloration. They were suddenly dented and wrecked to repair, and Lonnie's windshield had a large fracture on the passenger's side. Arriving moments before, from what she could remember, both were as new. Baffled, she left the glass, turning towards the stairs again. Sunlight beamed in through the front windows along her back, but went unnoticed and unfelt as she crept towards the second floor in a second attempt. Dread filled the air surrounding the wooden staircase. She could feel a heavy sensation swirling about the space. The tiny thin hairs along the back her neck instantly magnetic against it, lifting and standing against the energy flowing beyond her slim physique. Something is here? Somebody or someone is really here? She questioned it, pondering the thought as she tiptoed, finally reaching the upper level. The awful feeling swooped over top the banister where she lifted her hands, reaching for her brother's bedroom door. She shielded her face behind it, in terrible fear of the radio's devilish voices. Seconds had passed as she peered inwards at the spacious bedroom. Remarkably, the room had altered unimaginably as she spun from side to side, confused at the rearranged bedroom. What in God's mysterious world? She marveled, peering in another moment, exceedingly baffled. She dropped to her feet, balling her arms against her knees, lying on the floor. Her eyes were clenched tightly as she began a childhood prayer. Just a foot from her, the Watson radio began to radiate, a luminescence of sinister evil. The display flickered as it tuned in stations, rambling through them, playing a word at a time as if trying to speak. Avenue, Il, Kau, Me, In. It wailed at her, but she ignored the voices breaking through the horrible static. Continuing her prayer, she tightened her knees against her face and chin. The radio clock above her on the dresser continued to demand her. BEI, again static. SHHHHHCCCCC, bitch, Yahoo, worth. Less static immediately broke their communication again. ZZZZSHHHCC. Fucking bitch, die with us. Suddenly another voice, gentler than the first, intervened, cutting the communicating voice. Avil, it's your godfather, I'm. The white noise broke through them again. Yes, sorry darling. Suddenly the radio flung violently from the dresser, shattering against the wall, opening an undeniable crevice into the paint. Avil glared up from the floor, where her eyes widened at the sight of it. The radio's display had landed on top of her. Shaking it off using her arm, she cautiously raised onto her feet. Dink? She wondered. The strange electrified voice sounded much like her father, but not the father she remembered as an adult. Her father's voice had roughened over the years before his death. His severe anxiety led to his endless drinking and drug use. Avil was too young to remember much of it, but learned he had ultimately overdosed on morphine just a week prior to her 17th birthday. After her mother abandoned him with her and Dennis, things never went back to the way they had once been. The split was devastating for them as a whole. Dink was a shortened nickname for Denny. It was given to him from his father after meeting a famous Detroit baseball pitcher. The name stuck around. Family barely used his biological name anymore after that. She stood another moment staring at the freakish room surrounding her. The walls were saturated in something greasy. Baffled, she approached it. The inhuman plasma appeared colorless as it began trickling down the wall onto the carpet. It slowly reached her sneakers as she stood silently watching. She lifted her foot and then lowered it, realizing the substance was identical to the old highway where she found herself alone. Ectoplasm? The words surfaced into her pondering thoughts, recalling something she had witnessed on the old oval television. A low-budget VCR cassette tape Dink had rented for them both while Dennis was away visiting a church group. He was older than her. He was 24 at the time but hadn't yet moved out on his own. Avil often remembered those nights. The bedroom furniture had singularly morphed into something straight out of a horrible nightmare. Quarter-sized cockroaches began hissing at her, falling from the dresser top as they clattered towards her legs. She fought to move, but the matter from the wall had imprisoned her from jumping away. No, oh God no. Get off of me. She shrieked in desperation, stroking away a dozen or more crawling up her ankle. She pulled again, but her sneakers were tightly submerged into the muck. Damn it, let me go. She cried, sobbing uncontrollably as the roaches piled onto both sneakers. The fleshy roaches clung onto her legs as she fought with both hands to shudder them off. Panicking, clutching handfuls of them, they began biting fiercely into her skin. She screamed ear-piercingly in total disbelief. Her hands trembled as she squeezed her fingers tightly into them, busting their shell-covered guts all along the Stanton carpet and her shivering hands. You God, please, get them off. She wailed in pain, fingers bleeding and painted in disemboweled roach guts. Her feet continued to fight through the substance, kicking her knees frantically to break out, She finally fell out from both shoes onto the floor ahead. "Avil?" asked a familiar voice ahead of her, as she lifted her eyes from the carpet underneath her. Squashed roaches were smashed between her fingers as she pushed her body up from the floor, realizing she was no longer alone. Her eyes fixed against the woman in front of her. Much older than the one she had spoke to, when they had a brief conversation at Mars Grocery. The aging woman was terribly wrinkled where the skin had deluged deep in along her cheeks. Her hair was thinned and brushed back in a hair clip, as she sat among the bed coverings of her Dennis and Lonnie's room. "Hi there, sweets, delicate one, isn't ya?" The woman stared at her as if she could read into her very thoughts. Avil smirked, shaking her head, muddled by the intruding woman. "How did you get inside? Are you following me?" Her emotions turned quickly into anger as she crept another foot towards the woman sitting. "Don't trouble yourself over me, Avil," she responded, smiling with a mouth full of black and rotten teeth. Deviant, she leered at her standing just within the door fixture. Avil suddenly noticed a gruesome gash along the woman's inner thighs. Her dress was partially raised as she sat crookedly on top the bedside. "You're bleeding?" she questioned her, now staring blank at her. Her eyes were deep hollows, as she lowered her face sluggishly to see. "Perhaps I am," she said as she raised her face back at her. "It's no concern of yours, Avil," she added, while pulling her dress over the wounds. A Masonic pattern of black and white checkers was stitched heavily into her gown. "You're breaking and entering," being her. "If Dennis or his wife Lonnie arrive home and see you here, either of them will report the police." Avil responded, shaking still from the thought of the traumatizing insects. "Avil, Avil, Avil, you have much to learn, and so little time to tell," the woman said tenaciously. "Are you crazy or something?" Avil challenged her before listening to any more. "I'm going to ask you once to leave and never show your face around here again," she responded, finally at her wits' end and agitated. She glared at the woman once again before peering out the window on the far side of the room. The sky was burning brightly overtop the countryside surrounding the farm. The trees were blowing steadily in the foreground and the road was desolate as it mainly was. "It won't be this sunny in hell, darling," the oddball woman said, still sitting in the same position. "It definitely won't be once they pull you down into the fire, honey," she said. Avil flung her body towards her and pointed to the doorway. "Get the fuck out now, you lunacidal woman." The elderly woman immediately stood from the bed where her burgundy suede bow tie shoes laid heavily into the vintage carpet. "Death is coming, sweetie, you can't remain stuck between among the good and evil," she said, walking away, passing her as she stammered down the stairwell. Avil stood a brief moment wondering what she meant, as the front door closed softly shut down below in the den. A moment passed and Avil was beginning to question the woman's outlandish remarks. She felt for her face again, immediately playing the scenario of the masked maniac back in her mind. This time she was unable to remember much of the ordeal. It felt as if it were a dreadful dream that had happened. Her face felt as if nothing had occurred, but the farm was mistakenly different. Things were moving around, revising themselves as if the world around her were no longer a physical being, but much more spiritual and evolving. The thoughts dwelled inside of her, as she trudged towards the old-fashioned kitchen. Pouring a glass of Bartolo Mascarello, the taste of rich dark fruit engulfed her mouth as she swallowed, hoping that her world would suddenly be not the nightmare it seemed to become. Purgatory, huh? She wondered if that was what the insane woman meant by stuck between good and evil. She thought harder about it, rationalizing with it. Finally, after another few seconds of trying to understand, she smirked and shoved it off as if it were just another meaningless idea. "Whatever has happened to me, sure the hell isn't death. I sure the hell haven't seen any bright white light, have I? You stupid cunt," she thought, briskly sipping another fruit-filled taste of her brother's favorite drink. A drink he would often choose after a hawking night at the plant. The daylight was beaming in through the dense tall windows. Both windows were pushed open as a steady breeze swiftly rolled in through the screen from outside. She lowered down onto the sofa, realizing how empty the house now seemed. Dennis and Lonnie, Alex, they were gone. Where they were, maybe work still. Possibly they had stayed at a friend's. She thought about it as she sat listening to the wind rear into the house. The subtle wind blew in, filling the room with clarity. She could feel the outside. It was much lighter to the touch. Inside, things were heavy and unusually dreading. It felt as if something outside in the nature or in the crystal clear air had rationalized with her now turbulent life surrounding her. Something appeared to be warning her through the elements of the unknowing. Things were weird there. Life was somehow going to be changed no matter what she thought she could do to fight it, and nothing would go back, not unless something greater had a saying for it. Chapter 6, Heart and Bones. Midnight, the moon had risen again as Avil slept slumbering on the 1970s Parsons-styled sofa. Dennis had brought it back from his visit to his late Uncle Bernie's. About a week after the drive-out, Bernie Cossack collapsed fatally at the age of 56 in the backyard while pulling weeds in the flower garden of his French Lick, Indiana property. An untimely cardiac arrest was the ultimate ruling from the coroner. Dennis had already used up the remaining portion of his vacation time but decided to make a second trip out anyways to pay his respects. Lonnie insisted heavily not long after, begging him to put the memorable sofa out for the trash, but he resisted her demands. He told her sternly that it was a memento of Bernie's and Bernie would roll over in his grave if he tossed it out for the bugs. The sofa was the key to his virginity, and that being said held very true to how Bernie viewed it while alive. He wasn't much of a ladies' man, but the couch on the other hand seemed to hold his undying love. The sun rose from outside as Avil lay buried deep against the back end of the sofa. Shielding her tired face, she immediately dropped her legs down onto the floor and began stretching her tired limbs. Her eyes met the wall where Alex's impressive portrait of her hung. She stepped near it, placing her fingers onto the rough-clothed canvas overstretching the rectangular wooden frame. Avil followed the dried paint until her index finger reached the significant number he had sketched into her forehead using a smaller, finer-tipped brush. An acrimonious 3 for whatever reason was left as a reminder to him, almost prompting him. It appeared to be out of nowhere. The rest of the painting appeared near perfection and more direct. Alex, the boy who had it all, had everything: a family, loving parents, a talent for art, but the thing he lacked most would and could not ever be his. The impossibilities were mounting against him. It was what all kids wanted most, to be able to run and interact the way other kids his age were capable of. The thought of it swept away as she peered at the painting briefly. She pondered him that sole moment, picturing him masterfully brushing away stroke at a time until that final added detail. It bothered her suddenly as she began contemplating the horrible masked attack playing it back again along the highway. The violent assault that had nearly severed her from the existing world had done much more to her. Nothing was as it was, not anymore. She vividly recalled getting struck bluntly from behind and falling onto the rigid road. After the painful wreck, things became increasingly hazy. She stubbornly tried to grasp the man's identity, only remembering the knitted mask. A black nylon mask gripping his face snugly as if his face were meant to be hidden. Avil imagined it closing her eyes as she fought to remember. She suddenly noticed a slight rip partially around the left eye opening. It was much too dark to see the color of his eyes, although she remembered something off-putting about him. How he spoke in a foreign accent. It was a strong, influential accent, one that didn't fit the bill in Briar Falls. And then there was that car? What did this all mean? She wondered cautiously, spinning back towards the outer wall facing the exterior windows. She became still, peering out into the vast landscape surrounding the quieted home. The sun was radiating abroad her face as she gawked out into the tree land in the far off. Alex's clubhouse was standing tall in the towering birch along the backdrop. Avil's brother had a slight interest in woodwork, and had built it using broken skids he had hauled back from the plant. He'd often take Alex up into the treehouse using a pulley system he rigged. Alex's face lit up every time, painting above the clouds while Dennis opened mail and clipped coupons from the local newsletter. He sat with him, mesmerized by Alex's astonishing outlook on life in front of him while he painted canvas after canvas on a homemade easel. Dennis occupied Alex with nature, the same way his father had when he was still a kid. Although Dennis had spent nearly all of his childhood hunting wild game, experiencing nature for Alex was more subtle, more humble, but it still gave him a sense of prosperity he wanted for his only son. The thought of Alex and Dennis gave Avil a stalwart sense of being alone. Emotions suddenly fluttered into her chest. She touched her face, realizing how cold she had become standing there. It felt as if a million sinister eyes were spotlighting on her that very second. Avil quickly spun again, staring up at the stairs. Her eyes blinked rapidly as she caught herself watching her brother's room from below. The prying eyes continued to engulf her as she leaned towards the slick railing. She could see nothing, stepping onto the steps yet again. Clenching her fingers tightly in horror, she pictured the horrible bloodthirsty cockroaches from earlier scurrying onto her. The thought horrified her as she sluggishly approached the second stair leading upwards. Immediately, a pair of rough fingertips wrapped tightly against her waist. Spinning to see who it was, she dropped along the burnt maple-stained stairs, holding her face in disbelief. Along the bottom step a severed head hovered above the floor, sweating of blood. Avil stared in total trepidation. Horrified, she clamped her eyes against her face, expecting the woman to leave her. Immediately she yanked her eyes apart to find the atrocious head raised and still facing her as she tucked her nervous body into the stairs, peering at the horribly dismembered face. Her chest began to pound vigorously, glaring at the lengthy hair streaming onto the floor beneath its distorted features. Sustaining on her, it gawked at Avil as she leaned deeper into the shadow-covered stairs, its bountiful eyes now squinting at her in total silence. Its filthy, dirty blonde hair brushing against the ground below her, as the light shining in from outside her began to dim down, surrounding her in a strange blackness. The unrecognizable face, still floating motionless, began grimacing towards her, opening its eyes as they waggled side to side, finally fixating on her again. Its bottom jaw dropped, revealing its nauseating, overly rotten teeth as if it were about to speak out. Avil could feel a numbness running through her as she gawked at it, unable to move. Suddenly, putting her hands towards the appalling, flying head, she pleaded with it. Panicking, her hands trembled uncontrollably. What do you want from me?" Her voice crackled as she asked it, realizing its attention had suddenly moved from her to the outside. Immediately, the severed head dragged behind the badly managed hair, sweating of blood and rancid flesh. It abruptly stopped before the window beside the doorway, glaring out into the darkening landscape. The sun had lowered halfway and the moon had sprung up somehow. Avil twisted to peer at the far side of her, where along the wall a gold-ornate 1950s Victorian clock hung. Something bad was going on. She could feel it growing around her. The time read 12:04 p.m. Immediately she turned back at the fetid skull, but it was no longer loitering beyond the windows. "Dennis, where are you?" she thought. "I can't deal with this alone, I really need you." She pondered as she lifted up from the banister, stepping back onto the floor where the horrifying head had watched her. The room surrounding her was now slightly altered, shielded in an unusual looming darkness that appeared unnatural. Her hands were still shaking as she glanced from one end of the room to the other, observing the room for the vanishing skull. "It's got to be a terrible trick. Nothing about anything I've seen has made any sense, unless I'm going mental." She questioned the last thing on her mind. I must be, because nothing I'm going through is normal for a girl my age. She thought again, placing her hands along her sides. Standing at the foot of the stairs, she carefully began walking towards the entryway, gripping the doorknob slowly as she left into the darkness outside. The nightshade covering the property had become dense and overrun with mayflies. Buzzing about her face, she swatted them until she made it into the driveway where the couple's Volkswagen combis were parked alongside each other, ignored under the moonlight. Dennis, she thought of her oldest brother, along with Lonnie and Alex. But mostly the thought of him broke into her noisy mind, still clattering with the vision of the butchered head and the haunting imagery of the room from earlier. The radio upstairs and how it had come on. And the familiarity of her deceased father's voice as it broke through the others. And that demonic energy scowling from it, defying everything she had ever seen. She thought about it all as she trudged towards the old lane along the front of the property. A sudden gust of wind carried along her, hitting her broadside as she steadied herself in the night. Oddly, the wind had picked up momentarily after abandoning the farmhouse. She turned back a split second, aiming her eyes up at the red farmhouse in the distance. Avil Dresburn continued to wonder if the long-haired cranium was still gawking at her from behind the glass. Attempting to rationalize it, her eyes stared into the musky darkness ahead of her where the windows sparkled under the night's stars. She was only certain of one thing as she glared across the property towards her brother's home. She was alive no matter what the dead had come to say to her. Avil swiveled back facing the lone street where only the sound of the crisp leaves strolled across the darkening night. Her gashed body was now a disregarded memory as she hiked in the direction of Lynn's one-room efficiency apartment on the further east side of Briar Falls. Lynn Ellenberg was one of the only girlfriends she had confided in since moving in with Dennis and his family. Lynn was in her mid-30s and had a 7-year-old daughter who also suffered physical complications after a local obstetrician-gynecologist failed on delivering her suffocating baby. Hannah's umbilical cord had wrapped around her delicate neck, cutting valid circulation from her airway. After 5 minutes of resuscitation they managed to get her to breath, but it was too late. She already had extensive brain damage and would never have that chance to talk or crawl on her own. It devastated Lynn to no limit, but she ultimately loved for her and would keep her no matter what kind of therapy the state would provide her with. Lynn Ellenberg and Avil had become friends 2 years prior after meeting each other at a Halloween fair taking place in town just after the sun had dropped. The once-a-year event was known by residents as the Farmers' Square Off. At one point in time, the fair was an event where the town gathered to celebrate October with fine-grown produce, wine tasting and all of the Halloween decor you could ever imagine in a tightly knitted town. Townies would hide along the fruit stands full of freshly dipped candied apples and chocolate-covered worms in their horrible costumes and scare the wits out of all of the younger children walking hand by hand with their parents. It began on the 25th and ended the evening before trick-or-treat night, which in Briar Falls was the night before Halloween. Since then the Farmers' Square Off had become more of a mingling spot for the country club and their lifted trucks, but Avil was not the typical lustful girl who gave in to temptation of a young lover's lust. Lynn lived with her daughter in a housing complex known as Shepherd's Wall for struggling families. Her parents were also struggling but across the state line. They visited once every few months to see their daughter and grandchild, but the loss of their oldest son Wendell had somehow dampened their lives into a dreadful dead spin. Wendell Ellenberg had left the couple yearning after a freak accident on his motorcycle. Tire marks were burned across the blackened road where oil and gasoline saturated the rugged road where the bike had somehow went awry. Fragments of his torn clothing and debris were also discovered scattered along where the mangled bike laid against the guardrail. It was almost unrecognizable to the eye. His body had been discovered hours later lying lifeless in a nearby wheat field. He was 3 days from turning 40 and only months away from being a newlywed. His fiancée of 8 years since then, had moved out of state and hadn't been in contact with his family ever since. The unexpected death of Wendell had somehow chased her away along with her dreams, leaving both of Lynn's parents questioning her love and commitment for their son after not appearing at his funeral. Chapter 7, Hinder. Avil peered off into the mucky night where the darkness grew uncontrollably faint around her. Her eyes gathered the landscape as she trailed along the shoulder of the old road. Her shoes clapped against the pavement and were no longer sinking within stride. Her mind was rambling the same way it had when her mother disappeared from her life. Suddenly, she found herself standing alone in the pitch darkness. momentarily stopped along a gathering of fresh leaves somebody had randomly piled at the bottom of their property line. She peered at the house in the distance and noticed how dreary the tall colonial appeared in the thickness of undying shadows. The withering roof stooped and bowed and somewhat cried towards her as she stared in quietness. Her face tingled for a split moment, ignoring the ancient home. An old haggled woman lived there, and had since she could remember. The disturbing woman was almost immobilized and used a walker to get around. On some warm peculiar afternoon she would make her way outside and water the disintegrating orchard behind her home. Avil had passed by a handful of times on her way to the grocery. She held her sides, leaning forward to catch a much-needed breath of damp country air. Her eyes suddenly sprung towards the road again. Ahead of her a pair of dim lamps began approaching her. They were more than a mile out, but they were coming. The road was narrowing as she crossed over to the opposing side. 100-year-old trees dangled overtop her as she steadily walked in the direction of her girlfriends. "Avil, Avil darling, it's time to open your eyes," whispered a soft phlegmatic voice. The voice of a middle-aged woman. Avil Dresburn paused a moment and stared up into the trees surrounding her, wondering if in some way a dream she had been in. It came closer as it juddered, repeating once again, A.V.Teal? W.E.H.T.Re, we won't tell E.A.V.Eu. Avil continued hiking in the same direction as the voice growled and roared into her ears. Disdaining it, she spun back and caught a glimpse of the lamps glistening in the nightfall. The lights were still far off in the valley above the road as they wound around and went out of sight for a split moment. Then again, she could see the set of lamps approaching through the thick birch leaves hanging over her. Her eyes traced the dead leaves until the light blinded her. "Who's out here? I know you're following me," she cried, as she raised her hand gripping a low branch in front of her. Her face was lit by the light coming at her as she tore her hand away, facing the light swelling in front of her. "Stop, Avil!" called a stronger-toned voice, one that sounded much more aggressive than the previous. Avil's attention was on the lamps again, spurning the unnatural voice as it left, disappearing into the darkness as she stepped towards the street. She crossed over the paint and fixed herself in the center of the gleaming lamps. Listening to the motor rumbling before her, she thought again about the hostile assault, what seemed to have happened only hours earlier. Facing the road, her rapturous eyes immediately began to grow steadily towards the oncoming light as she listened patiently. "This is Avil, now ride it back," whispered a faint rugged voice shuddering out from within the trees. "Follow the light, sweetheart," urged another, somewhat reminiscent of her great auntie Sue Dresburn. "We will always be watching, baby," called another spirit-like voice, electrifying all around her, the same as the haunting radio from a night before. Her face froze to the sound, the tone of an older male, a familiar voice she hadn't heard since entering into Dennis and his wife Lonnie's master bedroom. "Gorgeous, your daddy's here now. Come, run for the light, go now." Heartrending, she hesitated as she shrieked back as tears broke loose finally as they saturated both of her cheeks. "Daddy, I knew it was you, wasn't it? The radio?" she replied, stepping towards the phenomenal lamps coming rapidly in her direction. Her hands were stretched in front of her as it whirled into her. The sudden breathtaking light bolted into her dainty body, leaving only a trace of crumbled leaves from where she stood. The voices had died off, leaving the darkness and nothing else.